all. Welcome, Ashley, and welcome to everyone joining today at MassCEC and beyond. We're really excited about this new MassCEC speaker series, which will be highlighting experts, pioneers, and practitioners from a variety of existing and emerging climate tech sectors and disciplines, as well as subject matter experts who could provide insights into the broader economic, social, and technological dynamics shaping our industry. Today, we're going to focus on inclusive utility investment, also known as on-bill financing, which is an exciting novel approach to financing building decarbonization and electrification work. Ashley Muspratt with the Center for Ecotechnology will share her experience and knowledge. Welcome, Ashley. Ashley's president and CEO of CET, the Center for Ecotechnology, where she leads the organization's growth and expansion of climate solutions across the Northeast. She holds an MS and PhD in environmental engineering and energy and resources from UC Berkeley and resides in Western Mass. But before we turn to you, Ashley, I want to provide a little bit of context for today's discussion. Many of you are aware that decarbonizing the built environment, and that's over 2 million structures here in Massachusetts, is one of our most difficult energy transition challenges in terms of its scale, cost, and complexity. And of course, most home and business owners can leverage MassSave incentives to subsidize weatherization, which of course includes insulation and air sealing, heat pump space and hot water heater installations, and more. But most building owners are left with a building decarbonization project cost balance, which must either be paid up front or financed in one way or another. And to put the cost in perspective, thinking about this challenge, according to an analysis completed by the Building Electrification Institute and the City of Boston, so just thinking about Boston alone, a 3 to 5 billion, that's billion with a B, financing gap would need to be met to decarbonize Boston's 70,000 low to moderate income households by 2050. And this analysis focused on 1 to 4 unit buildings and mid-rise multifamily buildings up to 6 stories. And it's worth noting that that $3 to $5 billion figure represents the gap remaining after MassSave and other incentives are applied. And it's also worth noting that that estimate includes a variety of IRA incentives, Inflation Reduction Act incentives, which of course are now threatened. So without those incentives, that funding gap would be considerably larger, as much as $4.5 to $5 billion. So again, this is for Boston only, for 70,000 households. Just want to give everyone a sense of the scale of the challenge and the enormous amount of investment necessary to meet our building decarbonization and electrification objectives. And of course, financing is not the only barrier to widespread adoption of building electrification and decarbonization equipment, materials, and strategies. There are customer adoption and education barriers for renters, the landlord-tenant split incentive barrier. There's a variety of pre-weatherization challenges, and for many, electric rates which discourage electrification, though I'm happy to share that the state and the utilities are exploring promising short and medium-term solutions there, and MassCEC is working very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Energy Resources on that score. Now, to be clear, there are a variety of existing building decarbonization finance options for building owners here in Massachusetts, including but not limited to the zero interest heat loan, property assessed clean energy or PACE financing for certain commercial and industrial building decarbonization projects, a relatively new loan product offered by the Massachusetts Community Climate Bank, which targets low to moderate income households. And of course, building owners could finance projects on their own, depending on household income and credit via personal loans or other approaches. So I want to emphasize that certainly building owners have options here in Massachusetts to finance their building decarbonization and electrification projects. And today we're just going to be talking about one of those options, which is a bit less common in our region, but has some, I think, really attractive qualities, which drew our attention when the Ipswich Electric Light Department, a municipal light plant, in partnership with Ashley and her group, approached us, the Mass Clean Energy Center, seeking our support for an inclusive utility investment feasibility study and pilot project, which we were really happy to support. Many of you may be aware that the Mass Clean Energy Center supports a variety of clean energy and climate technology innovation companies and projects over the last decade. We also support experimentation with innovative decarbonization program structures, climate finance approaches, and business models. And with that lens, we are really excited to support this novel approach to building decarbonization finance. And we've really enjoyed the partnership with you, Ashley, and with the team at Ipswich ELD. And that's why I'm really delighted to have you here and to have this conversation today. So we're going to have a bit of dialogue about IUI, inclusive utility investment. We'll cover some territory, and then we'll open it up to all of you on the webinar for Q&A. So please use the Q&A function and feel free to drop in questions at any time, though we'll hold off on addressing those questions until the end of the discussion. So let's jump right in. So Ashley, let's just start with the basics. What is IUI? What are the key elements of an IUI structure?
Sure. Well, thanks, Gillen. So IUI, or alternatively known as tariffed on-bill financing, or TOB, is a mechanism that allows a utility to pay for cost-effective energy upgrades at a specific building. So these upgrades could include weatherization, heat pumps, solar, and then the utility recovers the cost of that investment through a tariff tied to the building or to the meter of the building. So there are three really kind of fundamental features of IUI that set it apart from other financing options. And the first is that IUI is a utility investment, okay? It's not a loan to the building owner or occupant. The second is that inclusive utility investments must yield savings, and the cost recovery has to be taken from those savings. And this is really key because it means participation is compelling from the outset. And then the third really important element is that these tariffs stay with the building, okay? Like I said, this is not a loan to an individual. They're not attached to an individual. They're attached to the building. So if the occupant moves out or the building is sold, the tariff goes on to the subsequent occupant. Now, I think we'll have a chance to unpack each of these in more detail as we go on, but it's this combination of these three features that really makes IUI a mechanism that can unlock clean energy solutions for renters, for low-income homeowners, and for another really key segment, which are incentivizing early retirement of fossil fuel systems. Like if the Commonwealth is going to hit our decarbonization goals, like that's a key customer segment to get to. We can't have people waiting until, the last minute to replace their systems. Some really interesting data on IUI programs in other parts of the country. We see 5 times the uptake compared to a standard incentive program and twice the scope of decarbonization project.
Wow. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. This is substantially different from a lot of the other, I think, building decarbonization finance solutions that we've seen. So yeah, why don't we dig into each of these benefits a bit more? And I understand that there are several. Certainly one is that, and you got at this a little bit, that IUI approaches allow for a longer payback period than many other building decarbonization finance solutions. And that, of course, enables building owners to complete deeper decarbonization projects that might have higher costs. So can you talk about that a bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So like I said, the requirement of IUI is that the investment is yielding savings and that the payback is taken out of the investment. So the way that you achieve that, the way that you have the occupant saving as they pay and you enable the utility to recover the investment is to spread that payback over the life of the measure. And so the easiest way for me to explain kind of how and why this works is just pull up a slide. I like to put numbers to this.
Great.
So in this example, and the assumptions are just, for demonstration purposes. Let's say we have a heat pump that costs $20,000 to install. Let's say the annual savings are $1,800. The Mass TRM puts the life at 18 years. So rule of thumb in IUI is that the payback period is matched to 80% of the measure life, just to build in some buffer there. So that's about 14 and a half years. So I've just taken kind of two comparative situations here. 7 years, I chose that. That's the length of the heat loan. You can see in this example that the payback per year is, over $2,800, greater than the savings. So you've got a loss every year of over $1,000. And over the term of that repayment, over the 7 years, there's an accumulated loss of $7,400. In this example, it takes 11 and a half years for this customer to get to cash flow positive. In the case of IUI, where we're extending that payback period to 14 and a half years, our annual payback goes way down. We're keeping it under the annual savings. So every year there's accumulated savings. And by the end of the 14 years, there's an accumulated $6,000 in savings. So we're at cash flow positive from the start. So what we see in this example, of course, ultimately, the capital cost is the same, the savings to the customer is the same, but when we have these short payback periods, we front load the cost and then push the benefits way out into the future. Whereas what's really nice about IUI is that we're keeping the savings and the cost in sync with one another. So you're saving as you go.
So that the patient capital component of IUI is really critical here, just underscoring.
Absolutely. And this gets to, that customer segment I was talking about at the beginning, those, who we want to incentivize to have early retirement of their fossil fuel systems. Like, you're not going to do that if it's going to put you way in the hole. Also with people that anticipating selling their house or moving in less than 12 years, unless they absolutely have to make that investment, they're going to put it off. Whereas in this case, it's a no-brainer to participate right away.
Right. They could leave the home a year from the beginning of the project or 10, it wouldn't really matter. Both the cost and the benefits would stay with the home. Yeah, that's a really important distinction. You mentioned something else in the beginning. You noted that the payments under IUI are tied to the meter. What does that mean? So with with a loan, of course, the payments are tied to a human being, to the building owner, and with PACE, they're tied to property tax. But in this case, the payments are tied to the meter. Can you talk a little bit more about the kind of benefit that structure imparts?
Sure, absolutely. So as we've been talking about, inclusive utility investments is an investment by the utility. And as such, there's no individual who's taking on debt, who's then subject to a credit check, who, has to have an appetite for the loan. So by tying the payback to the meter, to the building, it means they transfer to subsequent occupants. Now, of course, the occupant of the building needs to agree to participate. In the case where you have a renter, the landlord would also have to agree. But what's great is that you're guaranteeing that the finance piece is yielding savings. And so, even if someone's anticipating moving or selling the building, in theory, these investments should make that building more attractive. It's increasing the value, it's making them healthier, more comfortable. A landlord can advertise, climate-friendly living, lower cost utilities. So these are all really attractive elements of IUI to current and future occupants of the building.
Thanks, Ashley. So somewhat related, given that it is administered by the utility, and that the payment's tied to the meter, it does bring to mind, regulatory challenges. And I think, if I remember correctly, with our support for the feasibility study that you commissioned for the IUI pilot in Ipswich, I think we did explore this question, right? We wanted to make sure, we wanted to check in with our friends our colleagues at the DPU and make sure, are we in the clear here? Are there any kind of regulatory barriers with regard to IUI? And I think that we found that there weren't in their view. Is that accurate?
That was the finding of the DPU. Now, importantly, we were doing our work with a municipal light plant that is, subject to a very different set of, regulatory structures and measures than investor-owned utilities. But we did go to the DPU, even though they're not directly regulated by the DPU. We got the green light, and there was an agreement that once we're operating at scale, the utility would present their like tariff structure to the DPU. But in their initial analysis, they had no problems with the program. And again, these programs are operating in over a dozen other states in the country. So,
and do you see
that precedent too?
Yeah, I think that's interesting to kind of explore this thread a bit more. In the other states, and I think I first heard about them years ago, in the utilities in the Midwest, actually. And is that a mix of investor-owned utilities and municipal light plants where they're operating?
Yeah. There are several investor-owned utilities who are running these programs at this point. I think in the early days, it was mostly co-ops and municipal light plants in the Southeast. But the most recent program that I'm aware of launching was with Duke Energy down in the Carolinas.
Great. Yeah, it is worth, I want to give kind of a shout out to, it is worth notifying or noting that Eversource proposed an IUI mechanism as part of its ESMP, and that was largely, it was more narrowly structured. It was largely focused on promoting customer-owned solar projects in communities with major distribution system infrastructure upgrades. But just wanted to note that this is on the radar of at least one of the major IOUs here in Mass, and we were certainly interested when we heard that Eversource had proposed that project. So there's another IUI attribute that I think is really exciting and interesting, and I think this is one that you and I have talked about, maybe one of the more interesting components of IUI, which is that it allows incentives and related financing to be tailored to the household income, kind of on an individual basis. Could you talk about that a bit more?
Sure. You're right, Gillian. I love this topic because I think IUI gives us a really elegant way to set the incentives, or as I like to say, get the incentive right. And I would go a step further too to say it not only allows us to tailor incentives to household income, but to tailor them to the very unique and specific impacts that a measure has on a building. Because as we know, a heat pump system costs a different amount for every single house that we do and has a different impact on the heating bills of that house, depending on the style of the home, the weatherization situation, et cetera. And we can take all of that into account with IUI financing. So I'm going to, again, pull up my slides because this is easier to demonstrate with numbers. Let me go to my next slide here. There we go. Okay. So in this example, I've ratcheted up the cost of the heat pump installation from $20,000 to $25,000. I left the annual savings where they are, but I've also introduced kind of another buffer rule of thumb that's used typically in our IUI, where we try not to exceed a tariff amount that, let me rephrase this. We try to ensure that the amount that is paid in a tariff does not exceed 80% of the estimated annual savings. And again, we don't want to exceed 80% of the measure life. So in this example, we have the same payback period. We have the same payback per year, but the maximum amount that we can recover is $20,736, which means there's a portion that can't be financed with IUI, and that is an upfront cost. And this upfront cost, to me, is precisely where the customer becomes cash flow positive. So this tells you, you certainly wouldn't want to give a penny more than $4,264 to incentivize a customer to move forward with this, because by definition, they are going to be cash flow positive. They are going to be saving money from this investment. And so, as Galen said, a utility can decide how much of that upfront cost to buy down or incentivize. And it could be for low-income customers, they decide, all right, we're going to buy down that entire upfront cost. Whereas for more higher income customers, they might choose to incentivize none of it or a small portion of it. But it is possible from like a regulatory perspective for the utility to make site-specific, building-specific decisions on how much of that upfront cost to incentivize or buy down.
And to be fair, Ashley, so just thinking, playing devil's advocate, right? I think this is very attractive. On the other hand, and I'd be curious to hear if you're aware of how utilities in other jurisdictions have addressed this. There's often a reasonable pressure to, with the exception of kind of carve-outs for low to moderate income households, to have kind of a flat incentive structure, which I understand, right? I think it can be more difficult, perhaps from a regulatory or even a political perspective, to basically have endless variety with regard to setting those incentive levels.
Sure.
So do you see utilities kind of in other jurisdictions embracing this approach? Because I think you've just explained very well why it's so attractive. It allows you to kind of reserve financial resources and target them very specifically on a household by household basis, which ostensibly would lead to more projects and a better use of funding. On the other hand, I think one could reasonably argue that having different incentive levels could be challenging.
Sure. Yeah. As part of our feasibility study with Ipswich, we worked with a nonprofit think tank called Clean Energy Works based in DC that is really working to promote and scale up IUI across the country. And their perspective on this is that typically a utility would maintain a menu of fixed incentives that would sort of come in under the amount that of these sort of a typical upfront cost. And then they would have discretionary funds to use to incentivize participation. There is, for regulatory reasons, there's some like nuanced distinction in what you call these pots of money. So there are the incentives that everyone has access to, and then this is a like participation incentive. And the way that a utility can justify paying a participation incentive is because there are territory or network-wide benefits that all customers ultimately experience when a utility is running an IUI program, because as they're increasing the number of kilowatt hours sold, they're smoothing out their load, they're able to reduce their spread their fixed costs over more kilowatt hours, and that can lower costs for all customers.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you. And I realize too that of course there are so many kind of ancillary or adjacent topics here, and that's one we're not really going to have much time to cover. Are the kind of related grid impacts of everything from the way that an IUI program might dramatically increase electrification to, of course, other neighborhood electrification efforts. But maybe a topic of another speaker series. But there was one other, I think, barrier that many of us are familiar with, that it at least appeared with the work in Ipswich that IUI seems well positioned to address, which is this notion of the landlord-tenant split incentive. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term of art, it of course describes this dynamic in which a renter may be very motivated to make building upgrades or to electrify or decarbonize the unit in which they live, but they have no agency to do so. They're not the building owner, and the landlord has agency, but perhaps not in all cases, but in many cases lacks the incentive to make those investments because they're probably not paying the energy bills, and nor are they benefiting from improved comfort from things like a shiny new heat pump. So I'd love to hear you talk about the landlord-tenant split incentive in the context of IUI.
Sure. So I would say there are like two key features of IUI that help galvanize renter participation. One we've sort of talked about, which is the fact that these are investments by the utility tied to the meter. So of course, no renter is going to invest in equipment for a building they don't own and may not occupy for long. But because they're being guaranteed that if these upgrades are made to their space, they'll be saving money, there would be a natural inclination for a renter to want to participate, whether they think they'll be there for 6 months or 6 years. So the renter is taken care of by the fact that they don't have any personal obligation. I think the other really key feature here is that we transfer the burden of investment from the landlord to the utility. Because like you said, most landlords are going to make just-in-time investments in their buildings because since they are passing on their utility bills to the tenants, they don't sort of accrue any benefits from making the investments. In this case, though, where the utility is making the investment, certainly if there's an upfront cost, the landlord would be responsible for that, not the tenant. But these are modest compared to the total cost of the investment. I think most business savvy landlords would see that the benefits they get from participating, the increased value to their building, the fact that they can then advertise to tenants that their electricity bills are going down, that they're climate friendly living. I think these are all good motivators for a landlord to want to participate. And certainly in most cases, if not all, the upfront costs that they would have to pay would be less expensive than the full cost of, a fossil fuel heating system when they ultimately need to make that investment.
So maybe, I know this has now come up a couple of times, but maybe how soon do you think we'll see IUI finance projects listed on, Zillow listings and the like? I think this is maybe where we need to be headed, right?
That's my dream.
Well, and the state is looking certainly at building energy labeling, and we've, there's some cities that have taken, some leadership in that arena. So perhaps we're not that far off from that. So thank you for all of that, Ashley. This is really helpful. I think it really helps folks who haven't dug into this better understand all the different attributes and benefits of IUI. But this all sounds good in theory, and the study I think was very encouraging. But how about in practice? So if we could talk about the pilot a little bit, just by way of reminder, MassCEC was very happy to support you and Ipswich ELD with regard to the study and the pilot. So I would just love to hear a little bit more about the pilot and what we learned from it.
Sure. So after completing a really successful desk-based feasibility study in Ipswich, where I mentioned we did this kind of regulatory analysis, we did a business case analysis for the utility. We surveyed the customer base to make sure that like a mechanism like this would be attractive to customers. And then we did an analysis of the extent to which we could use IUI to finance the measures that we care most about. So when all of that checked out really nicely, we moved into the pilot, thanks to funding from MassCEC. And we were able to demonstrate this mechanism with 3 homes. So it was a small capital pool, but it was at least, the pilot was really intended to demonstrate that this works, to kind of work through process and workflows with between CET, the kind of program administrator, and the utility, to also work with the lawyers to really flush out and refine the terms and conditions. So we ultimately served 3 homes. They were oil heated homes. We had a low income customer. We had a first time homeowner who was very eager to decarbonize. And then we had someone whose furnace was at end of life. And for financial reasons, they were going to replace it with another oil furnace. And it was IUI that enabled them to make the switch to heat pumps. In all of these cases, there was some upfront cost. The customers happily paid the upfront cost in the case of the first-time homeowner and the end-of-life system. And then the utility and CET through our Community Climate Fund bought down the upfront cost for the low-income customer. So they did not have to pay any upfront cost on their system. We installed weatherization, heat pumps, and in a couple of the homes, heat pump hot water heaters for these systems. So we completed this pilot about a year ago now, close to a year ago, and we have been sitting ready to go to scale, but have been working through applying for negotiating a line of credit from the USDA to capitalize the full-scale program. They have a line of credit from their Rural Energy Services program that Ipswich intends to use. Hopefully that credit isn't going away, but that's really been the delay in going to the next kind of full scale in Ipswich. And our priority is to have some of our early customers be renters and gas customers. So we have a more kind of comprehensive suite of customer types that we've demonstrated being able to serve with this mechanism.
No, and that's thank you for that. And of course, that's many folks, I'm sure, participating on this webinar today are aware that the economics, moving from oil to heat pumps are certainly more attractive than from natural gas to heat pumps. So, and that, of course, that's a challenge.
Although
all financing approaches, but
I mean, in municipal light plant territories, and as long as there is the large, $10,000 MassSAFE whole home system, in a lot of cases, actually, that pencils out better than the oil between the incentive and getting that better cost differential of lower cost electricity at an MLP. You get a wider split than you would from like IOU gas to IOU electricity. So it was just circumstantial kind of bad luck that we didn't get a gas participant, but in MLP territories, they're definitely very feasible.
Great. So maybe we could pivot to just briefly reflecting on a couple of the other existing building decarbonization finance options. So we've been talking about IUI. We mentioned the heat loan at the beginning of the conversation. We mentioned PACE. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of reflect on some of the advantages and disadvantages of IUI relative to those two platforms, the heat loan and PACE financing.
Sure. Yeah. So, to summarize from the customer perspective, IUI compared to the heat loan, the heat loan's a loan, right? So again, the customer needs to be taking on debt. They have to pass a credit check, and they have to really think that they're going to be in their home long enough to really get a positive return on that investment. So I think that's a really key distinction between the heat loan and IUI. I also showed that, with shorter term payback periods, you're really front loading costs and pushing benefits into the future, whereas you keep them nicely in sync with these longer payback periods that you get with IUI. I'm not a PACE expert, and residential PACE doesn't exist in Massachusetts, but one of my understandings is that with PACE, you are putting a lien on the building, and I think this can complicate refinancing or selling the building in a way that IUI does not. I really like to think about IUI as compared to your incentive budget though, and looking at like what you can do with IUI that you maybe can't do with incentives. We talked about like using IUI to really get the incentive right. And I think both of us, or I'll speak for myself, I have the position that like, given the amount of money we need to mobilize to hit the Commonwealth's decarbonization goals, like we want to be really discerning with how we spend those incentive dollars. And we have to make all our money go as far as we possibly can. So again, I just did some back of the envelope math here to just kind of make a point that I'd like to show. It's
Well, and to underscore that too, it's not like, this concept is certainly very familiar now to, our colleagues at DOER, who I think thought very critically about EV incentives, and I'm sure jurisdictions in other states as well, right? Where I think we've moved toward, capping EV incentives for very expensive EVs, which is, another way to, another form of kind of tailoring incentives. So it's not like this notion of tailoring incentives to the buyer is unheard of with regard to the energy transition and related incentives.
Yeah, right. So in this example here, I'm comparing 100% incentives to IUI. And I think the point I'm trying to make is like, an incentive is one and done. Like once you spend it on a customer or on a measure, like you can't get it back. Whereas with IUI and other loan mechanisms, you're recycling that money over and over again into your economy. So I just, for fun, took the target that we have in the new MassCEC plan of installing 16,000 heat pump systems in low-income homes. And the plan is to do that with 100% incentives. I just made up a round number of what that would cost at $25,000 per home. So this is going to cost us $400 million just for 16,000 homes. So then I thought, well, with the same total spend, what could we do with IUI? And I went from like highest to lowest interest here. So in this first example, if we assume we're paying 3% interest, I set my future value at 400 million. So my base kind of principal cash is quite a bit lower. And in this situation, I'd be able to serve 30% more homes for the exact same amount of money over the 14-year period of like one measure life of a heat pump. And if we keep going through, if we could get capital at 1.5% interest, would increase the number of homes that we can serve for the same amount of money by 64%. Of course, lower interest rate, our starting capital is, pool increases. And then if we can get 0% interest, then we can really make this money go far, and we can reach 108% of homes. So I just think it's important to think about the sort of the recycling potential of IUI as compared to straight up, full and 100% incentives.
No, thank you for that. And of course, landing that kind of, concessionary capital is very challenging in this environment, but nonetheless, good to have those figures at hand. And of course, that's one of the roles that state climate banks play. That was certainly a motivating factor for those behind the GGRF, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, greenback money from the federal government. So again, good to know how those dollars could be stretched further at various interest rates.
I think too, climate change is here. So we are, I think, increasingly able to conceive of the damage costs of climate change. But for a while, it's been this far off issue. And my point there is we can start to really think there is a social cost to carbon, right? So if we apply a social cost to carbon and consider ROI from that perspective, it's huge. It's like 1,000% ROI, right? So it's really, what are you including in your calculus when you think about like the,
Right.
cost of living?
Um, and I mean, maybe that's a kind of a good pivot then to, I think, one of our last questions, and I'm looking at the clock here and I want to make sure we get to some of the great questions in the Q&A, but so you've got the pilot under your belt. We've got encouraging results from that. You're thinking about scale up. So we've kind of discussed a number of times now the need for just a massive amount of patient concessionary capital to make to really accelerate and ignite IUI and frankly building decarbonization finance generally, even if it's not under an IUI structure. So what are the strongest prospects that you see right now for that kind of capital, and our foundations, for example, program related investments, are they fair game? Are you in dialogue with entities like that?
I think foundation program related investments would be a phenomenal source of capital for these programs. I'm in some conversation. I'd love to be in more if there are any funders on the call or people who know funders. Because like I said, depending on how you're measuring your return, it could be considered quite high with this. And the appetite and the interest is there. We have other utilities who we're currently working with to develop program and to launch pilots. This is not to say there's not, some wariness. I think, in the Commonwealth, we like to see things to believe them. Like locally, I really believe that once we're at scale in Ipswich and in a couple of other utilities and really demonstrating the impacts of this, then we'll have, really accelerated demand from other utilities. And then it's a matter of just getting the access to capital. A typical MLP would need about 10 million a year to capitalize a program. So it is a large amount of money that we need, but I think, finding mission aligned foundations that are doing PRIs would be ideal.
Great. And I know this is at least one of the questions in the Q&A, so I'll kind of pose it here, but folks are curious about what kind of activity or traction you're seeing in Massachusetts. And I think it sounds like it may not make sense right now to talk about, specific conversations you're having with specific utilities here in Mass, but you mentioned utilities, but to be clear, there's interest in Massachusetts.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
For IUI.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, that's
We're working with several right now who want to run pilots. And then I would say there's like a next handful of MLPs that are interested and have said, I just want to see what happens in Ipswich and then move forward. So there are about 40 MLPs in Massachusetts, and we've been in conversation with many of them about this program.
Right. Well, there's kind of one other just quick observation I wanted to make, and then we'll jump to the questions, which is, and I really, frankly, forgot to bring it up during the benefits piece, but it does occur to me that there's this notion that there's just less friction with this approach for the building owner, meaning that, yes, as you note, you still have to have the building owner bought in. You're going to have, an audit. There's got to be a scope of work for the decarbonization project. But at the end of the day, it's the homeowner that's just paying a little bit more on the utility bill that they already pay credit check. So I think, oftentimes with the energy transition, of course, we focus a lot on deployment, deploy. But we've got an enormous amount of inertia to overcome with a wide variety from the smallest single family homeowner to the largest building owner. And it just occurs to me that making that process easier, you're not having to apply for a loan, is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Does that resonate?
Keeping it all kind of in-house with the utility and the administrator. And related to removing friction, right? It completely changes the conversation with the customer from like, here's your audit, like, good luck, to, hey, your utility wants to make these investments in your home, and you will have, little or no upfront cost to do it.
Well, this has really been spectacular, Ashley. Let's get to some of the questions. I'm not sure if you can see the questions, but I'm going to try and pick out. There's some wonderful questions here. And I think some of them have been addressed. So I'll try to pick out some that. So this is a good and fair question. What happens if the occupant doesn't pay the surcharge or falls behind on their energy bill? So did the utilities, did Ipswich ELD think about this, think about defaults? And if so, how would a utility protect against that?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, in the terms and conditions, a utility would typically include an ability to turn off electricity for lack of payment. I mean, just like they can do now in like a worst case, last resort situation. But I would love to point out that data that dates back to like 2005 when some of the earliest programs got going, and comes through present. The rate of collections for existing programs is 99.9%. And remember, people's bills are going down, not up, the sum of what they're spending on their energy costs. So this program actually makes paying bills more, not less affordable.
Okay, great. There's another question here about whether or not IUI can be used for larger commercial properties. And I certainly want to hear your take on that. My understanding is that that these deals are often cut, and I don't say that in a pejorative way. I think it's great that the utilities do this with sometimes with large commercial building owners because the projects are large and complex, and they essentially structure an on-bill payment approach on top of incentives that may already exist, whether it's MassSAVE or incentives in any other state, similar incentives in any other state. So my understanding is that those types of structures are sometimes deployed in the commercial industrial sector, but more formally with regard to IUI, do you see any utilities kind of embracing an IUI approach for larger commercial and industrial properties, or do you see IUI as applying more readily to single family and small multifamily, or all of the above?
Yeah. I mean, in concept, in theory, there's no reason this couldn't be applied to commercial properties. I think you know, if you're talking about larger properties and not like small businesses, you'd just be looking at much higher capital outlays. So, you know, it would just make the pool of capital that a utility would need that much greater. But I don't see any like structural reason why it couldn't work.
Great. Okay, that makes sense. I think there's one question here, and I'm pretty sure the answer to this is no, but I'll pose it anyway, which is, would a utility earn an ROI on this investment as they would for distribution system infrastructure investments?
I mean, a utility can you know, factor in an interest rate on the capital they're using to make the investment in the period over which they're returning it. I mean, what that would do though is shift more into the upfront cost. So, you know, the more of a return they're trying to get, the more of an upfront cost there would be. And then, you know, if the utility is going to pay that anyway, then why bother with the interest? Or you may be turning more customers away from participating if that upfront cost gets too high. And that's why low cost capital is so critical, because you really want to pass a little or no interest on to the participant.
Okay, thank you. You talk about this a little bit, about one of the benefits being that or one of the challenges with other building decarbonization finance approaches is that if it's tied to the building owner, then they may be less willing or interested to invest in projects because they're going to take that cost with them in terms of a loan. Are there any studies that explore the extent to which IUI finance projects impact the resale value of homes? So I think we know, for example, that studies that some of the national labs have done that solar PV systems, for example, have a positive benefit, and that reflect in the in a very rational way, often equal to or closely equal to the value of the solar on the home's value, which in some ways, many ways, doesn't surprise. But I'm wondering if you are aware of any studies or data that have explored this issue to the extent to which these upgrades might impact.
Yeah, like I said, I think you could draw some logical conclusions, as you were saying, but I haven't seen specific studies on that. I've seen data from existing programs showing that like building sales are not inhibited by these tariffs, but I haven't seen the specific question you're asking.
Okay. And Ashley, to the extent that you're comfortable talking about it, you've mentioned that you're in conversation with, I think you said, well, utilities, and I assume that to be primarily MLPs. And we talked about Eversource's interest in this earlier, and we talked about the regulatory, the fact that there doesn't at least appear to be a regulatory barrier to the investor-owned utilities looking at IUI. Have you talked to Eversource and National Grid or Unitil about IUI?
Not yet. Not yet. Our approach has been to first really prove this out with municipal light plants. We administer the residential energy program for about half the utilities in the state. We're contracted by MWEC to run the Net Zero program. So we were already working with 20 of them, plus a couple of independent utilities. And just their size, their scale, the regulatory structure made them a really nice place to start. But certainly my vision is to see this scaled up across Massachusetts, not just to MLPs, but to the investor-owned utilities as well.
Great. That makes sense. Well, if you'd like some introductions, we'd be happy to connect you because there are certainly a lot of smart folks at the utilities that at the investor-owned utilities that I suspect would be very interested in exploring this approach.
Those conversations.
Yeah. Well, I think it looks like a lot of these questions are kind of covering ground we've already covered. I'm just going to look a little bit more here and see if there's anything that appears to be substantially different. There are a number of questions related to kind of default. If a unit becomes empty, for example, in a multifamily, how would that be addressed? I think that's a good question, actually. And there's one, you have one challenge with regard to an entire building becoming vacant and default or any other type of default risk with regard to the utility. But if you've got a medium-sized multifamily and you've got one or more units that become empty and rental income drops, what does that look like for a landlord and for those tenants under IUI?
Yeah, so in the case that a rental property is vacant for between occupants, a utility has two options. In most cases, with Ipswich anyway, the utility bill goes to the landlord when an apartment is vacant, and so that the landlord would pay the tariff for the months that it's vacant. The other option, if that's not what's happening, if the electricity is just shut off for some reason, then you just delay the stop the payment. So if there's let's just say there's a 12-month repayment period, just simple math, and it's empty for 2 months, then the period of time would be 14 months, but you would just pay 12 months of tariff. So, and then you certainly want to be wise about the state of the building you're investing in. Like if a building is, about to be condemned or in, really terrible shape, then the utility would not move forward with those investments. So there are analyses that are done upfront to make sure that the building has a life that's longer than that of the measures being installed.
Makes sense. Well, we're just about at time, Ashley. So I think I'm going to close things out. But it's been a really wonderful dialogue. It's been such a pleasure to work with you and the CET team. And I don't know whether or not anyone from Ipswich ELD jumped on the call, but our partners there have also just been really wonderful, and I think embraced this in a way that was so refreshing. And so we really enjoyed working with all of you. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today. Of course, we'll do this again. I believe our next topic will focus on industrialized construction. So we're really happy to dig into that in March, I believe on March 14th. And so with that, Ashley, I just want to thank you and thank everyone again who tuned in and really enjoyed the conversation and the partnership with you, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Galen. My pleasure. And thanks everyone who joined today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks all. Take care.